Okay. Yeah, I think we're recording now. So Kirra, thanks a lot for taking the time out to discuss your experience with the dissertation. And before we move on with the interview, I just wanted to put out a disclaimer that proceed or override those instructions, especially from your supervisor as well. This is just your own experience and how you went about the dissertation and what kind of tips you picked up that you'd like to share also with our audience.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Pleasure.
So just to begin with, could you just give us a brief description of the topic of your dissertation? How did you come up with that topic? And what your advice would be for people to how can they start thinking about a topic for dissertation?
Okay, so my topic was on workplace bereavement and how organisations manage that. I chose that topic because it's an area that I work in. I work in end-of-life care, so it was sort of a natural progression from there, and I knew there was a big gap in the market there. So it wasn't a particularly difficult find for me. I went with a qualitative study because it's a very emotive subject. So there's no real need for data there. So I stuck with just a qualitative, even though in my proposal form I suggested that I might do both. I might do a little bit of quant as well. No, qualitative one on its own is enough. I think if you're going to do two, qualitative and quantitative, you've got to do either both very well or just stick with one. Yeah, so I think when you come to choosing a topic, choose something that you love or something that you're going to enjoy for at least 6 months, something that you're passionate about. I think this, having done 12 modules through the MBA, this is really your chance to shine. This is for you to show this is what I know, and this is how I've taken the learning from the MBA and applied it to my area of expertise. Yeah, so that's how I got to my topic.
Excellent. And you obviously did very well on your dissertation. You got a distinction, well, provisional distinction, we should say.
Provisionally, unless they find the typo that the 7 was actually a 5. But yeah, all fingers crossed.
Right. So one thing we often see with the dissertation is, obviously each person has a different supervisor, and it's really hard to make everything consistent across the board. Like the consistency coming from, doing 12 modules, there's more consistency there because everyone's told the same thing. However, dissertation is more about your interaction with your supervisor, and it's a lot more subjective. What has your experience been in being able to set the supervisor expectation, and also, what advice would you have for students to do that?
So yeah, I mean, supervision, just from my own cohort, we found that supervision varied widely in everything you could possibly imagine. My thoughts on supervision would be that if you can choose your supervisor, I would, and have a conversation with them in the first instance, because apart from nothing else, you get buy-in from them. It's kind of your opportunity to say, this is what I want to talk about. How engaged are you in helping me deliver this? Because you need them to deliver this. You are basically writing this for them to give you the marks. So you really want their input. I was quite upfront with my supervisor about what I wanted. I knew what marks I needed to get a distinction for the MBA. So I was really quite explicit with him. So I really just said to him, look, don't give me any feedback that is less than the distinction. I only tell me things that will help me get that distinction. I think the other thing with supervision is timing, and having a conversation about how the timing works for both you and for them. Some people found that submitting things chapter by chapter worked very well because it allows you to have interim deadlines and get the work done. And as long as you can meet those, it's fine. Some people found that just submitting a full draft at the end was much more manageable because then you didn't have those interim deadlines. So it really just about what works for you and what works for the supervisor, and just having a constant conversation with them so that you all know on what page you're on.
Right. So just
the other, sorry,
go on.
Yeah, no, I was the other point that I was just going to make about the marks was that if you are looking at all to move on to a PhD at any point, you do need a distinction at masters. So it's worth remembering that.
Right.
That's what
So I sense you're looking at the PhD.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't get enough of studying, huh?
No, love it.
Excellent. So setting the expectation in terms of what grade you want from your dissertation is important to let your supervisor know that upfront, so that they can give your feedback calibrated to what you have in mind.
Yeah, I found that useful.
Yeah.
And I found that really useful later on when the feedback came in, because I tasked them with that very early on. I knew that if there wasn't much coming in, then there wasn't much I needed to change. If he said this is really good, I kind of knew that it was already in the mark zone that I needed. So it was almost a little bit of reassurance. If lots comes in, then you're not quite there. So you know how much more work you've got to do.
Right.
Get it there, if that makes sense.
Makes sense, absolutely, yeah. Another thing that we've come across is, there's a lot of talks about how to do the proposal and also the ethics form.
Okay.
So what are your suggestions around how to deal with the proposal, like in terms of how broad or how narrow the topic should be, and also the ethics form, because there seems to be a bit of not confusion, I would say, but it just seems to be one of those things that, students ponder a lot over, and there's a lot of kind of back and forth on how this is meant to be really handled.
Yeah. So the proposal form, that's where you kind of first lay down your ideas of what you want to do. Almost certainly it will be too wide if you pick up the topic that you put on your proposal form. It will be too big, it will be unmanageable, and so you will need to kind of find some way to filter that topic right down. I think one of the most important parts of that filtering to make it more narrow is what you're not saying is nothing else is important. What you are saying is, this is a really big topic, but this, for the purposes of this project, this is the only bit I'm going to focus on, because basically that's all the word count you've got. And in order to get that kind of academic and critical depth, you've got to have it quite narrow, and it's got to be quite niche. The ethics form, it was a major source of stress for, I think, for all of us as well. Having done it, it wasn't as bad. I worried more about it than I probably needed to. Most of the questions on it are fairly straightforward, unless you're doing sort of studies with children or sort of vulnerable groups. You shouldn't have too much trouble with it. It does take time. It's not a quick form. It's also worth bearing in mind that ethics form is also the form that every researcher in the university uses. So from your PhD to to our researching staff there, that's the form they use as well. So it's exactly the same thing. I would also look to having some thought around your consent form and your participant information leaflet, and if you're using interviews, the kinds of questions that you're going to be wanting to ask. If you include that in your sort of as an appendice to your ethics form, that's quite useful. And you're just filling it in on what you know now. You can't know anything for the future, so you complete the form to the best of your ability with what you know or what you think you might do at the time.
All right, so you didn't have a crystal ball with you then?
No.
Right, okay. How did you mentioned that at the beginning, and I've heard this from many other MBA students as well, at the beginning your topic is almost too wide. So how did you go about filtering the topic? Is it like a discussion you had with your supervisor, or how did you kind of filter that down?
I think it was mostly tears, to be perfectly honest. I think I just ended up crying about it, saying, I can't do this. And I think if you're reaching that point, I think it's too big, because you just can't manage it. If it feels too dilute, and if you don't feel like you're getting any kind of really good information there, it's too big. Right. I think I kept on narrowing it down a lot of the way through the process, actually, right quite a way in. I was still narrowing it as I went along, even right down into as I got into towards the discussion.
Wow.
So it's kind of, you're constantly thinking about it. Can I make this? Can I narrow this a bit further to get that critical depth?
So what I'm hearing is that the proposal and the topic for the dissertation and the ethics form, these are more like living documents. Yes, you have a baseline to begin with, but as you probably go on into the literature review, and that's maybe where we should head now, is you start to look at probably what literature is available, and so I mean I'll let you answer this. Like from literature review, I feel that there is, from our previous discussion, that there's a bit of interplay between the topic of the dissertation and the literature review as well. So if you could highlight upon that.
Yeah, so I think when we put our proposal in, it did ask you what are your 5 kind of, at the current point in time, what are your 5 sources of literature? And that's quite a good place to start. I think with the literature review, you've got two, almost 2 verticals there that you're looking at when you're looking at the topic, because you're kind of looking at, well, what does the MBA literature say about it, and what does my subject say about it? And I think for mine, because mine was very niche, basically there's nothing on workplace bereavement in MBA coursework, so I could present a literature review which was not familiar to my supervisor at all. So yeah, you do need to sort of be constantly thinking about what that literature looks like, and where you're going to get it from. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember from our previous discussion that you mentioned, like if you have a topic of dissertation and you go and find literature review and you get 1,000 pieces of literature review, then it's maybe your topic is too wide, so you need to kind of narrow it down. Absolutely. I remember you saying one of those things.
Yeah, I think a lot of people found they were on well-trodden ground when it came to literature. Yeah, it's just, you're going to have to just find some way to find some niche or some gap within the literature to do that. So the other point that I just wanted to make about the literature review, which I learnt a little bit later in the process, probably too late, is that there's a very different, a literature review is very different to a review of the literature. Now, I have a friend with a PhD in research methods, and when I asked her for guidance on a literature review, she gave me guidance on a literature review. What we're doing is a review of the literature.
Right. Okay.
A literature review has a very, very defined set of a defined search strategy where you exclude articles at different stages through it, and then you end up being left with, maybe 20 articles, and your literature review is then made up of those 20 articles, which you then critique and grade and do all of that. Whereas a review of the literature is you just go and get everything that you can find within the time that you've got, and you present that in as a background. So actually what my understanding is what you're presenting within that literature review is actually, here's what's happened before I did my data collection. Here's all the literature about my topic. And so, yeah, there was a little bit of that search strategy going on, because you do need to start that. But it was, for me, it was a bit of a bright light moment going, oh my gosh, yeah, that is quite different. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Was that Suzanne by any chance?
No. No.
Okay. Right. Yeah, so that's a really important point, so the literature review is actually a review of the literature and kind of, I guess, setting the context, and also showing about how you clarified what data you will need to collect for the dissertation purposes. And moving on to that, actually, how did you go about, looking at surveys or interviews, especially because yours was a qualitative piece, as you mentioned. So I'm guessing there were a lot of kind of audio calls and video calls for it as well.
Yeah, so I did 3 aspects of data collection for mine. I did an organizational questionnaire, I did interviews, and I did a secondary data examination. So I was examining policies. So I put the three aspects of data collection together. Interviews were probably the most challenging, but not for any other reasons other than technological, really, more than anything. We obviously I did my data collection just as in the middle of lockdown. So everything that would have been a face-to-face interview then basically moved online. There was, having had a consent form to do the interviews, I then of course needed another verbal consent because I did end up audio recording the interviews for the sake of transcription. So I ended up with sort of two places where I had the recording so that I could make sure that I wasn't missing anything. So I use Zoom. People have been using Teams and Skype and even a phone call. I did on one of them, and I had, there's an app called Otter, which is like a transcription app. So I had that running on the side. So when I was doing the phone call, I had the Otter going and the phone on speaker, and it was sort of transcribing everything as I went along. But
did it do a good job?
It was not too bad. I mean, it was quite time consuming to then go back and transcribe it. Don't underestimate the amount of time transcribing takes. It's I mean, my interviews were, I think my shortest one was about 40 minutes and my longest one was nearly 3 hours.
Wow.
So transcribing was quite a challenge. Certainly with my qualitative interviews, what I did was I sent, because of the topic, because it's a bit of an emotive topic, I sent some guideline questions to the interviewees ahead of time. And the reason I did that was not to say, these are the questions I'm going to ask you and you should answer them, but it was more to say, these are the questions that I'm kind of looking for answers to. And it gave them a chance to think about their answers, which meant the interviews would be more focused. Whether that was correct or not, I don't know. Whether that I lost substance because of that, I don't know. But
it's always tough, isn't it? But it sounds about right. Like even before making this video, for example, we kind of like discussed what areas you'd like to cover that's going to be useful to the audience, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's always that aspect. I'm guessing you covered that in the methodology bit and explained that you had reached
Absolutely.
out to.
Yeah. And yeah, I was going to say the methodology chapter is really the place where you state clearly what you did and why you did it, and if you didn't do something, why you didn't do it. So there's no right or wrong answers. It's just everything you do, you have to justify why you did it or why you didn't.
Yeah, it's a thought process, isn't it, to show what things you considered, and it's a way to show your diligence as well about the whole process.
And it's your transparency for the markers. They want to see that you're not hiding anything. So they need to see that, and that needs to be explicit. I think the other thing about data collection is you'll have a lot of data, and a lot of it you won't use, and you'll have all these transcriptions, and some of them, you know, you'll use a sentence out of it. so I think that's a bit frustrating in some ways, because you've got all this cool information and you can't embed it anywhere into the project. So.
Yeah, I can imagine that. You just feel like, you know. Yeah, I get that. In terms of, you know, interviews, how did you narrow down, or how did you even reach out to people who you thought would be, you know, the right people to reach out for the interview for your dissertation? How did you narrow that down?
Well, I had a fairly broad idea. So I needed bereaved employees. I need employees who I sort of set, and the ethics, I think the ethics form or the proposal will ask how you've bounded your data collection group. So that's probably the best place to start. So I kind of I stuck with UK organisations. I had to say, well, they need to have been employed within the last 10 years, or the bereavement need to have been within the last 10 years, or they needed to be employed at the time that they lost the person. So as long as you can demonstrate how you have bounded that in some way, and then you just need to go on a search for how you get those interviewees, and that can vary. And in the textbooks, it gives you all the different ways that you can find sources of data. So you can use your own networks, you can use the networks of those networks, you can get volunteer people and giving you data, but all of the sampling methods all come with elements of bias. So if you are using
Yep, I think we've lost connection. Okay, right. So we were talking about how do you reach out to the interviewees, and how do you, get the pool of interviewees narrowed down, I guess.
Yeah, so that kind of depends on where you're looking to get your data from. So if you're doing it within an organization, you'll use your networks within that organization. If you're looking for external people with opinions on or thoughts on it, then you'll need to go and search far and wide. I think your own networks are a good place to start, and then harnessing technology has been made it really easy. So you can use you can use LinkedIn, you can use the WBS sites, you can use the alumni, you can LinkedIn, all sorts of places to try and get people to help. I found,
I guess, WhatsApp cohorts as well, right? Obviously,
yeah,
your topic
absolutely,
is a very niche,
absolutely.
but yeah.
Yeah, and it's been hard during COVID, because I think the lockdown made the number of interviewees less, I think, because everybody's just busy and everybody's got lots of stuff on. So I think that had an impact on certainly on my data collection. And again, I just declared that to say,
Right.
it's the technology, and the pandemic really has just affected how many interviews I could get, and certainly the quality of the recordings of them. So,
Right. Yeah. So if the dissertation wasn't challenging enough, you had some extra.
Yeah, exactly.
You wouldn't have it any other way, probably.
No.
Okay. The next stage, I guess, is a discussion aspect, right? And how do you then approach the discussion? So now you've done the review of the literature, you've got your surveys and interviews in place. How do you now go about the discussion? And I remember you using this tool called NVivo as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we'll start with NVivo first. So NVivo's cross-referencing software, which I thought was brilliant, but it takes a long time to learn to use to get the maximum functionality out of it. You can use it at a very basic level. I thought it was brilliant for the literature review as a place to store information on all the articles. And I worked out that I've got a few, if anybody's interested, I've got a few sort of shortcut tips which I picked up along the way of how you code the information through it. I would recommend, if you've still got assignments to do, start using NVivo now on a small assignment, because once you get to the dissertation and you've got sort of 200 references, they're much more difficult to keep track of manually. It's easy to do when you've got sort of 20 or 30, but yeah, once you scale it, it's much more difficult. So NVivo really good, unless you're adept at Excel, in which case Excel probably works as well. I'm not, but I would recommend it. I really liked it. Moving on to the discussion, your discussion chapter is really a presentation of the evidence that you found in your literature review and the evidence that you found in your data collection, and you putting that together with all your MBA learning over the past 2 years and talking about it and telling what you found. I think in the discussion, you need to understand what it is you're arguing. So having a really clear idea in your head of the point that you're trying to make, and you need to be constantly answering your research question through that. How does what I'm writing now answer my research question? And if it doesn't, maybe that needs to go out, or leave it there and take it out later.
So this is the meat of the critical thinking aspect that you need to demonstrate.
This is the bit. This is the big bit of the dissertation. You've really got to put your most effort into this. Even though literature review is really hard, this is the bit that will give you the marks, and this is where they want to see that critical depth and that sort of that joined up thinking. If you can come up with a way to visualize what it is you're trying to say, so if you can put in a model of some kind of what you're arguing, that I found that to be very helpful. The markers seem to favour that and appreciate some kind of visual aid of what it is you're trying to say, and then it also forms the basis for your discussion as well. That's certainly what I did with mine. And I mean, who doesn't love a model?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pictures.
Metrics.
Right, and just to clarify that, I get this feeling that the model is not something that's from the literature review. It's actually a model you come up with yourself to explain.
Yeah.
Right. It's almost your own model, and yeah, can be your own IP in the future, right?
Exactly. Yeah, but right. I found the markers really appreciated that to help explain what it is I was trying to say. So
yeah, that's a really handy tip. That's a really good tip. And not just for dissertations, for any big discussions, you know, we need to have, even in our companies and things like that. Always helps to kind of outline it as a simple matrix, right? Of some sort, possibly,
or a flow chart or something. And I think if you can explain it to somebody else as well, if you can say, this is what I've designed, does this make sense? And if you ask somebody who doesn't know anything about it, that's really good, because they ask really good questions. They ask really simple, obvious questions. So you think, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah, that won't work. So
yeah, absolutely. They expose the gaps in knowledge, right? Because you're absolutely spot on. Because if you go and look at a model with all the background information you have on the subject, your viewer's perspective is completely different to someone who has no idea about this. And your goal is to be able to explain it to someone who has no idea.
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, so just to wrap up this lovely conversation, what would you say worked well during the dissertation process, and what would you say, you know, that you would probably look at it differently or handle things differently? What are those particular aspects?
I think one of the things I found useful is I kept a redundant narrative file. So as I sort of wrote paragraphs that I then didn't use, I literally picked them up and put them into another file, so that if I needed them later, I could just literally pick up the narrative and put it back in again, or if it needed to go somewhere else. I think I spent a lot of time trying to articulate headings and subheadings, when actually what I needed to be doing was just writing. It's very easy to move things around at a later date. So actually just getting that ball rolling and just getting that writing, even if it's just bullet points, to get it moving. I got very caught up with changing the research question quite a bit, and I only latterly worked out that actually that's part of the inductive process of this. So that kind of backwards and forwards, you know, I know this and now I need to go back and see that. So there was a lot of that, and it's fine to keep changing your research question. I would just track the changes of it. So I change it from version 1 to version 2, but keep all of those versions so that you can go back to it, and it might end up that you just end up reframing it slightly differently. What you don't want to do is write a research question and then start to answer it, and then you say, okay, no, that doesn't answer that question, and then you go back and change the research question again, or you change the whole course topic direction of your dissertation. So I wasted a lot of time doing that. So hopefully that's a tip for somebody else.
So how can you minimize that? What would you have done differently?
I think just know that that's the part of the process.
Okay.
That moving backwards and forwards between it is normal and expected, and it's okay to keep changing your research questions. What you're trying to do is you're trying to build a draft, a final draft, and really the only purpose of the final draft is to exist. Everything you can change as long as you've got enough time to change it. The draft just needs to be in existence.
Right.
And it's okay just to keep moving back and forwards. You're constantly refining. Your literature review is constantly under review as you move through the process. What else did I find useful? I think, like I said, talking to people who don't know anything about the topic, because they ask really good questions. I found if I'd going out for a walk, sometimes I just needed to get away from the computer. And if I go out for a long walk, I actually came up with really good insights. And take your phone with you, because you can just talk into your voice memos on the phone and you just get it down. I also found I was waking up in the middle of the night with really good ideas, and you can't use a voice memo other than wake my husband up on the other side of the bed. So actually I used to keep a piece of paper beside the bed, a notebook and a pen, So I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd jot down notes, because if I don't write them down, then I can't go back to sleep, and then I've got to try and remember them by the morning. So yeah, just those kind of things.
Yeah, I get that. Again, this shows, how dedicated you are to the topic of your dissertation, how passionate you are about it, but also shows again how the human mind works, in the subconscious things still kind of, the human
Yeah,
mind moves over those aspects, isn't it, in the subconscious mind. And as we all know, that some of our best ideas come in the shower, or as you said, in a walk, or while
exactly,
sleeping.
exactly.
So,
And I think it takes over your life. It takes over your life, and it takes over the lives of those you live with. My
right.
children used to mock me towards the end, because I had do not disturb signs on the door while I was doing interviews, and they just thought it was hilarious that I was still doing the dissertation. I think one of my children said, gosh, she's been doing this for 3 months and she's only written the introduction, and I just wanted to punch her. You have no idea how much work I've done to get to this point. So yeah, it does kind of take over your life and those who you live with.
So, any tips to handle mocking children?
No, I probably best not say that. There's probably a safeguarding issue there.
Okay.
I found using little pockets of time was really useful. Things like, so when I took my kids swimming, I'd always have like an article with me or a chapter, the textbook with me, and I was kind of flicking through it. So using all those little pockets of time. I took a lot of time to understand the process, because they want to see you use the research process. And so getting a really good understanding of that, and going beyond just the textbook that they've given us. There's a couple of textbooks that I use which I found really useful, which we can put links to. There's a Moodle available on the University of Warwick site called Destination Dissertation, which is a generic dissertation module, but there's lots of really good pointers and tips about how to write a really good abstract, or how to craft an argument, and how to present that. So that I would recommend that. Yeah, and I think just constantly telling yourself, how does what I'm writing help answer my question? And that allows you to keep you focused. And whether you need to sort of print that and put it up in front of your face every time you're writing, so you're constantly reviewing it and constantly going back to it, I think that will help. Yeah, and I thought going back to your ethics form, you will need to go back to your ethics form throughout the process. And I think one of the things I found with that was, when I went back, it looked like it had been written by a high school student. And I thought that was really funny. I thought, God, this is just terrible, the ethics form, what I've written. But actually what it told me was actually how far I'd come as a researcher, even though I'm still a novice researcher. It really showed me what a big distance that has been, even though it was just 6 or 8 months. You learn a lot in that time, and it's actually, if you can fall in love with the project and make friends with the project, you'll enjoy it. And for me, it's been a really rewarding process. It's been stressful and stress inducing, and I've cried a lot, but it's been worth it, and I've learned a lot.
And it set you up to do the PhD next.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got to get that literature review thing right though.
Excellent. This has been wonderful. I'm sure a lot of students will find this very, very useful. And just kind of having some of your, experience and knowledge from a student like yourself who's got a distinction or a provisional distinction, again, is really handy for students going into doing the dissertation. And again, just as a disclaimer, this is not to replace, supervisor instructions or Warwick instructions in any way. This is just an informal chat about your experience, about your dissertation.
Absolutely. And I'm happy, if anybody wants to ask me questions, I'm happy to be contacted via LinkedIn or however.
Probably in the social learning comments, you'll probably get a few follow-up questions.
Absolutely.
And again, we'll post some links, as you said. Excellent. Thanks a lot for your time.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.